hear it later. And okay, thanks everyone for joining us. Welcome to the 4th episode of Sierra Club BC's Old Growth Forest webinar series. My name is Galen Armstrong. As many of you who have been on the past webinars will know, I'm the lead organizer, and I've been organizing this series along with some help from volunteers. I'm calling today from my home in Duncan on Cowichan territory. And we think a lot of you who are joining us today have been here on previous weeks, so we don't need to go over all the technical stuff. Most of you are looking at your Zoom screen right now, and there's a chat bar. For those of you who haven't already found it, you can click on chat, see all the chat that's going on, and you can see that John's written a welcome message. John's one of our volunteers helping with the webinar, and you can write any questions that you have that can be answered. So as we get into the presentation today, you can write questions and we'll do a Q&A session towards the end. And I'm gonna pass it over to John just as soon as I can unmute him. Just give me a second here. Okay, John, over to you.
Right, thanks Galen. So yeah, I'm John, a volunteer with Sierra Club BC and calling in from Victoria on unceded territories of the Lekwungen speaking peoples. Before we get started today, we'd just like to thank everyone who's carried out the action from last week and who's handwritten a personal letter to Forest Minister Doug Donaldson calling for a halt to old growth logging. We really appreciate the efforts that have been made. We'd also like to thank those who have been active in the Facebook group, including sharing information and some more great tree photos. And don't forget, if you have any questions or talking points that come to mind after today's webinar, then please don't hesitate to post those in the Facebook group too. It's great to see some nice conversations going on in there. So before we begin today's main talk with Andy MacKinnon, I'd just like to hand over to Jens to provide an update. So Jens, hopefully you're on the line and we'll pass over to you.
I hope I'm unmuted now. Can you hear me? Great.
Yeah, we can indeed.
Thank you. And I'm also calling in from Lekwungen territory today. And I'm super excited because we have one of the fantastic ecologists in this province, Andy MacKinnon, and I'm excited because there are few people who can share the wonders of the ancient forest, the web of life, like Andy. And it's really important because there's so much beauty in the ancient forests, and there's a lot of heartbreak too, and it's important to remind ourselves why we are in this campaign. And this week is a particular dramatic one this month because some of you know we found even more information about just how much the BC government, in this case, a BC government agency, BC Timber Sales, wants to log. So I only want to take 2 minutes to share with you some of the highlights from our media release this week. And you can find more information later, and we can talk about both Andy's talk and some of this news after his talk. But essentially, we found that it's even more. It's 8,800 hectares, and that is only BC Timber Sales, proposed old growth logging on Vancouver Island in the next few years. People are really very angry, particularly here close to the southern tip, because one of the cut log areas is close to the Juan de Fuca Trail, close to Port Renfrew, so very high tourism value in addition to the ecological values at stake. And it's a very dramatic example of how the BC government is going forward with logging plans, not only in terms of how much, but also the lack of transparency. It's too difficult for concerned citizens to find out how much the government is proposed to logging, how much is set aside, and what are the mechanisms that the BC government is using to make sure that enough is protected for the species, for tourism, for indigenous values, to make sure that communities can have a diverse economy. John and Galen will share later, again, reminders about what you can do to help build the pressure. Today we are going to hear from Andy first about the beauty of and the wonders of the web of life in the ancient forest. If you want to read more about the details, check out our website, sierraclub.bc.ca. On the bottom, you find a link to the media center with all our recent media releases and more details about our release from Monday, April 29. And I talked with CBC and the Times columnists, so I haven't seen the stories out. It wasn't the CBC news, but there should be more online and in the Times columnist this week. And one last piece of information regarding the area close to Port Renfrew. The government gave 2 more weeks to look into the situation. So now they are looking at a deadline for the sale at May 10. So we have a few more days to raise or to increase the pressure on government to drop this particular area close to the Juan de Fuca Trail. If they would go ahead and auction this area, it would be way more costly to stop the proposed logging. So that's one fight we have to win, and then we're still in for the big one. And thanks again for this opportunity to share this update. I'm looking forward to hear from Andy.
Jens, before you turn it over to Andy, I just want to ask one favor of you. In the chat box, could you put maybe just a couple sentences of the language you want people to use when they're writing their letters to Doug Donaldson in terms of dropping the sale of that area? Could you just put a couple sentences that people can draw from? Okay.
Yeah, I will do that in the next few minutes. Okay.
And do you want to turn it over to Andy?
Yes, please. Andy MacKinnon, one of the most respected ecologists in our province, and looking forward to hear from you, Andy. I hope you are unmuted.
Am I unmuted?
You are.
Well then. And shall I just leap in then?
Yeah, click share to share your presentation, and then you can leap in from there.
All right. Let's see. That looks...
there we go.
And we will now... There. How's that? Can people see a slide that says what we don't know about coastal temperate rainforests?
Yes, it looks great. Thanks.
All right. Well, thank you very much for the invitation to be on your webinar today. Jens asked me to address a topic somewhat similar to a brief talk I gave in Duncan alongside he and others with the North Cowichan community, trying to make some changes in the way their community forests are going to be managed. I've worked as a forest ecologist for about 3 decades, primarily on British Columbia's coast, and I've been involved in land use planning on Haida Gwaii, Great Bear Rainforest, even back to Clayoquot Sound. As a researcher, a lot of the research projects that I was involved with were looking at differences between old growth and second growth forests. And it would be a lot shorter presentation today to tell you what we do know about coastal temperate rainforests and old growth forests in particular, because there's so much that we don't know about the structure, composition, and function of the old growth forests. And that was part of what I was telling the people in Duncan about, and part of what I'm going to try and focus on today. One of the reasons why it's important to protect old growth forests, and one of the reasons that I've been working with the Sierra Club and others to try and get the government to protect more of these forests on Vancouver Island, is that there's so much that we don't know about their structure, composition, and function. We have so much to learn from these forests. We were involved in a discussion yesterday about forest inventory on Vancouver Island, trying to come up with some common approaches to forest inventory among the provincial government and the NGOs involved. And the idea of logging old growth forests being considered sustainable resource management was raised. And I want to make sure, as I mentioned at the meeting, that nobody goes away thinking that logging old growth forests can be considered in any way sustainable. But today I want to talk just a little bit about what we don't know about coastal temperate rainforests. I'd have to say from my time in research, we learned quite a bit about old growth forests, and I think we learned just about enough to appreciate how much we don't know. And so I think as a researcher, it's critically important that we hang on to these forests, not just for all of the regular values that are usually ascribed to them, but also because there's so much that we have to learn from them. And that opportunity's gone when they're gone. Just as an example, I thought I'd start with Western yew, Taxus brevifolia. If we go back to the 1990s, there was a bit of a gold rush on Western yew in British Columbia. It was determined through a broad screening in the United States of a lot of plants that you could extract precursors of Taxol from the bark of Western yew, and that it was an important chemotherapeutic agent against primarily breast and ovarian cancers. And so Bristol Myers Squibb in the United States started buying up bark from these trees. People in British Columbia started a mini gold rush on yew trees and managed to wipe the yew trees out in areas of southern Vancouver Island and in the West Kootenays to harvest the bark and send it south and get rich. And you can see in this slide here that TPL Phytogen estimated that they need 50,000 kilograms of Western yew bark to extract Taxol for research testing and clinical trials over the next 2 years. 50,000 kilograms of bark will produce about 6 kilograms of Taxol and require the harvest of almost 5,000 Western yew trees. And if you're familiar with yew trees, they're not a common tree. You will find them occasionally on the coast and in the interior wet belt, but 5,000 Western yew trees is an awful lot of Western yew trees. We don't find the yew trees in pure stands. So that's an awful lot of trees that need to be harvested to produce the Taxol. Well, it turns out that every plant that everybody's looked at on Earth so far, from mosses and liverworts up to the tallest trees, has fungi living inside them, inside their leaves, inside their stems, inside their roots. This has been known for grasses for a long time. We're just starting to learn about the diversity and abundance of fungi and non-grass species. And here's a study published in 2015, not on Western yew, but on English yew. I think we can assume the situation would be somewhat similar. At the top here, of the 242 endophytic fungi isolated from surface sterilized yew tree twig segments, only 2 of the fungal species produce Taxol in a defined liquid medium. So it turns out that after all these years of knowing that you could extract some of these compounds from Western yew, it's almost certainly not the plant that's producing the compounds. It's fungi living without any obvious symptoms inside the plants. Just an example of how much we don't know about these plants. So if I'm just going to go back for a second here. From these yew twigs, they isolated 242 species of fungi. Extraordinary. And every single plant that anyone's ever looked at, I would assume every single plant in the forests of British Columbia, in the grasslands of British Columbia, contains a rich abundance of endophytic fungi, of which we know just about nothing. Plants and fungi work together in a lot of ways. So about 94% of plant species on Earth have fungi growing associated with their roots. That's especially important in British Columbia because the fungi that grow associated with the roots of our conifer species are generally have as their fruiting bodies the large edible mushrooms. And with the exception of morels, all of our large edible mushrooms are the fruiting bodies of fungi growing associated with the roots of trees. It's usually presented in that simple format, so that when you go out in the autumn and you see all of these large fungi in the forest, they are almost without exception the fruiting bodies of fungi growing attached to the roots of trees. There's lots of different kinds of associations. These associations are called mycorrhizae, which means fungus root. There's a great diversity of different associations, but 94% of the vascular plant species in British Columbia have fungi growing with their roots. The fungi help provide them with water and minerals. The trees provide the fungi with sugars, but also, and that's the way it's usually presented in very simple format, most plants, and certainly all trees, have many different species of fungi attached to their roots. In a study that we did in the Victoria watershed, we found 12 to 16 different species of fungi attached to the roots of each Douglas fir tree. And each of those fungi is attached to the roots of numerous trees. And as a consequence, every plant in the forest is connected directly or indirectly to every other plant in the forest by fungi growing attached to their roots. This is another example that I'd like to suggest of a system that's critically important, pretty much ubiquitous, and that we know very little about in British Columbia. We know that not only are sugars and signaling hormones translated, we know that this is also a way that some of these plants, the trees are best known, are actually communicating with each other, passing messages about things like drought stress and insect attack onto other trees so that they can be prepared. How does this whole system work? Really difficult to say right at the moment, but certainly not the way it's described in any textbook. And if we want to learn more about how natural forests work, we have to hang on to more of them. Just a simple example that I presented at North Cowichan from the work of Suzanne Simard at the University of British Columbia. She's demonstrated pretty clearly when you're looking at seedlings and saplings growing around the base of big old trees, seedlings and saplings that in many cases are the offspring of the big old trees, the seeds that have fallen to the ground. Those seedlings and saplings will oftentimes share fungi with the large trees, and the large trees will photosynthesize sugar, send them down to their roots through the fungal network to feed the seedlings and saplings, parents feeding their kids. There's lots of very cool fungal plant associations. This is a fun one for anybody who's here today who might be interested in gathering pine mushrooms. All of the plants that we see in the woods, the coral root orchids, the Indian pipes, the candy sticks that lack chlorophyll, that is the plants that aren't green, they're all fed by fungi attached to their roots, which are attached to the roots of nearby trees. Usually there's a number of different fungi that can do the trick. For the candy stick, the only fungus that transfers food from nearby, usually Douglas fir, to the candy stick to feed it, because it can't feed itself, no chlorophyll. The only fungus that we've ever found that feeds candy stick is the fungus whose fruiting body is the pine mushroom. So if you come away from today's webinar with no other useful information, understand that if you're somewhere where you see candy stick in the late springtime, you can come back and find pine mushrooms in the autumn. Plants and fungi also conspire in a number of our different lichens. This is a cyanolichen, one of the lung lichens. And this is a lichen that is found almost exclusively in British Columbia and old-growth forests. So there are a few organisms that are found almost exclusively in old-growth forests. You will have heard of things like the marbled murrelet and the spotted owl, perhaps, not on Vancouver Island, of course. But I think the species that are most closely associated with old-growth forests and are actually the most beautiful are a lot of these specialized lichens. In this case, these so-called cyanolichens, because they're a fungus, an alga, and a cyanobacterium all living together in one body, and they can do remarkable things. One of the most remarkable things about them is that we find them just about exclusively in old-growth forests. Okay, we can skip over that. So I suggest if you're looking for creatures that are associated with old-growth forests, you don't see them often on posters because they don't have the beauty of a marbled murrelet, perhaps, although I think they're much more beautiful. But anyway, you're unlikely to see cyanolichens or bat-head mites or any of these mushrooms anytime soon. And yet these are all species that we know only from old-growth forests. They require characteristics very distinctive to old-growth forests, like the Phaeocolybia kaufmannii in the bottom right, the mushroom, the Orobatid mite. And if we lose the old-growth forests, we lose these species. This is a neat paper that was done. Oh, I've blocked out the date on it. It was done 20 years ago, I think, by Neville Winchester and Richard Ring. I just wanted to make that Orobatid mite as large as I possibly could, and I unfortunately blanked out the date on it there. But I wanted to include this because of the concept of Sentinel and Extinctions. Now, when Neville did his PhD, he's now a professor at the University of Victoria. He was looking at the arthropod communities in 3 Sitka spruce trees in the Upper Carmanah watershed at a time when the Upper Carmanah was scheduled to be logged. And he collected over about 5 years from the canopies of these old growth trees, he collected about 850,000 specimens of insects and arachnids, mites and spiders. And he found about a quarter of these species that he collected from the canopy were new to science, had never been described before, had never been seen by anybody before, largely because nobody had ever looked at the arthropods in the canopy. But he looked in second growth forests enough over the years to determine that a lot of these species are very specialized to the old growth habitats. And one of the specializations is that they don't disperse great distance. A lot of them are not winged, which is unusual for the groups that they're in. So again, if you want to find species that, as far as we know, are only restricted to old growth forests, I would start putting Orobatid mites on posters. I don't think it's going to happen anytime soon. But if I was in charge, I would have Orobatid mites on the posters. That's an awfully cute mite, don't you think? Sentinel and Extinctions are extinctions of species before we even knew they existed. Now, given that the first time we looked in the old growth canopies of forests in British Columbia, we found a whole load of species that were new to science. Most of the rest were new to British Columbia, which is to say new to Canada. If you consider old growth forests on southeastern Vancouver Island, which are reduced to less than 1% of their number, and you consider what sort of species might have lived in those communities, I think it's safe to say we'll never know. But given the numbers we've seen elsewhere, there must certainly have been some Sentinel and Extinctions there. So I think most of you have probably seen this lovely map of Vancouver Island showing where our remaining old growth forests are. And I think it's clear that there aren't a lot left on the South Islands and precious few high productivity old growth forests left elsewhere. And that's one of the reasons why a number of people, including me, have been pushing the government to start protecting a lot more of these forests. We need them for a lot of species habitat, including a lot that we don't know about, but we also need them for a lot of the ecosystem services which they provide. Here are some air photos of the Kennedy Flats area in Clayoquot Sound from 1937, 1938. On the right, the Gurgel lab at UBC made forest cover maps out of them using the same methodology that is used today to map forest cover. If anybody's interested, we have really nice, high-quality photos from the RCAF in the mid to late 30s for almost all of coastal British Columbia, which is pre-logging photos for most areas of the coast, including Clayoquot Sound. You can then look at the abundance of tall cedar in 1937 by interpreting the air photos. And then you can map the abundance of tall cedar in 2016, hugely reduced in the Kennedy Flats areas. And then we can begin to look at things as Ira Sutherland did in this paper from 2016, these so-called ecosystem services, things from wood volumes of red cedar and non-red cedar, salal greenery, edible berries, vaccinium species berries, marbled murrelet nesting platforms, and large cedar. He had Joe Martin out with him looking at cedar that might be called monumental cedar, or cedar that's appropriate for canoes and poles and so forth. And one of the things they turned up is that not only are these old growth forests critically important for a lot of other species, and almost certainly important for a lot of reasons that are unknown to us so far, but they're also really important for ourselves and for all the other creatures that use these areas, in this case, the areas around Clayoquot Sound. And because of, I think, different appreciations by a lot of different people, that a number of different groups have prevailed upon the government of British Columbia to leave more old growth forest vertical on Vancouver Island. This includes Metchosin, where I live, council passing a resolution that then went to the Union of British Columbia Municipalities, which is the annual gathering of all of the mayors and councillors and regional district directors in British Columbia, that it be resolved that old growth forest on provincial crown land on Vancouver Island be protected from logging, and so forth. This was echoed by the BC Chamber of Commerce, that recommended that the provincial government support the increased protection of old growth forests in areas of the province where they have or can likely have a greater net economic value for communities if they're left standing for the next generation and beyond. Doesn't seem like a radical request to me. And the BC Chamber of Commerce, this is all of the chambers of commerce around the province, are not known to be a notorious group of tree huggers. And then, so just to finish up, there are lots of groups that have been calling upon the provincial government to protect more old growth forests. The government has rather blithely ignored them. I'm very pleased that the Sierra Club and other groups, including I hope people on the webinar today, can continue to pressure the government to make some better decisions about what's happening on Vancouver Island. And one of the reasons that's important for me is not simply that it will give researchers more places to go and play in the future, but that it'll give us an opportunity to learn a little bit more about how these natural forests work. That's what I brought for a presentation. This is my first webinar. So what do I do now? Do I stop the share? That doesn't sound right.
Well, yeah, if you stop the share, then we just see your video, which is great. And if you're ready, we can move into some question and answer. I'm
happy to chat with anybody who's on the line. Thanks to everybody who's joined us today, by the way. Great.
Thank you, Andy. That was excellent. And I think, definitely what people have been, some of what people have been wanting to hear, some of the ecology. John, do you have any questions lined up? Have people been asking questions here? And of course, John's muted, no doubt. Let's see. Well, I'm going to pull up a question on the chat box. So we had, just so everybody knows, Jens did post some bullet points that people can use in their letters to the government, to Forest Minister Doug Donaldson. And we've got a question from Monica. She asked, Andy, how many ewe did they end up logging?
Nobody ever counted the number, Monica. They logged enough to basically remove you from the landscape on parts of southern Vancouver Island and parts of the West Kootenays. The number of trees that were killed for bark export was probably in the, I would think, low, say, between 5,000 and 10,000 based on the amount of bark that was exported, which doesn't sound like a lot when you consider how many trees we cut down in British Columbia each day. But yew trees only occur, usually occur a few to a stand, if they're there at all, throughout their range as understory trees in old growth forests. Oftentimes people have left them in clear cuts, and oftentimes those yew trees have died. So it's not a common tree, and it's not like you can go into one stand and cut down hundreds of them. That's not how yew grows. So the effect of harvesting, my guess, and I'll emphasize that nobody kept numbers for this, my guess would be probably at least 5,000 to 10,000 yew trees were cut in British Columbia, the bark stripped and sent south.
Thanks, Andy. And Monica, I did unmute you. Did that answer your question?
Yes. Can you hear me, Galen, if I'm talking?
Yep.
Oh, awesome. Technology. Yes, it answered my question. 5,000 to 10,000. I just find that so astonishing. It's terrible. We had a guest on last week or the week before who was talking about respectfully harvesting things, and yeah, that's just not the way to go about doing it. Thanks, Andy.
Yeah, the nice thing about determining that a lot of these compounds are produced by fungal endophytes is that fungi that are living inside the twigs and the needles of Western yew, is that if you're trying to extract the compounds from the Western yew, peeling the bark off the trees kills them. However, if it's actually fungi that are producing the compounds, and you can reproduce the conditions that are required for the fungi to produce the compounds, then you can grow the fungi without the tree in some sort of pure culture and produce the compounds without killing yew trees.
Thanks, Andy. We have a number of questions rolling in here. John, do you want to pick another one?
Sure, yeah. So the first one to mention is a simple question of why do buyers prefer old growth forests and what's it used for, and who are the buyers of this?
When trees are young and fast growing, they produce juvenile wood, which is usually the rings are widely spaced. The wood has lots of branches, so it tends to be quite knotty. And it's generally not nearly as strong or as handsome a wood as older wood. So as the tree ages and loses the branches on the lower part, it starts producing older wood. And so the older a tree gets, the higher the proportion of older wood to younger wood, the higher the proportion of knot free or clear wood, the higher the proportion of wood with small ring widths, which increases the strength of the wood. So the wood from old growth trees, in addition to being bigger piece sizes, of course, is usually stronger than the wood from younger trees, and it's usually more knot free than the wood from younger trees. And people use it for a wide variety of purposes. Old growth, of course, you can just cut it into dimensional lumber, which is the fate of a lot of it. It's used, residues are used for pulp mills, and a very, very small amount, but worth quite a bit more, is used for higher end things like veneers, like instrument wood, and so on. And as for who buys it, anybody who can. There are groups like Canopy that keep track of who's buying old growth harvested in British Columbia, and could tell you probably pretty specifically who's buying wood from any part of the province right now. That's part of what they do.
Great, thanks, Andy. Okay, going to another question. I just want to address that somebody asked about this being recorded, and I am recording it, and I will post it to YouTube. The last 3 webinars are already on the Sierra Club BC YouTube page, so you can, if you missed those, you can check them out. And for those of you who are on the email list for the webinar, if you've registered, you'll continue to get emails from me with the links to those past webinars. So this will show up between now and the next webinar. Looking to the questions, Meadow from the West Kootenays. This is sort of a question for me, I think, as the organizer, one of the organizers of this webinar. As someone from the West Kootenays, I'm wondering why there's so much emphasis on Vancouver Island. We're seeing logs pouring off the mountains here. And my dad lives in the West Kootenays, and my brother, I've got family and friends up there. I was just up there and talking to some of the folks about all the logging and proposed logging that's happening there. And it absolutely is happening at an intense rate. The reason that, well, today we're talking about Vancouver Island because this is one of Andy's areas of expertise and where he lives. But I intend to either extend this webinar series or more likely do another series where we can hear more voices from other parts of the province. But I will say that, a lot of our campaigning, not all of it, is focused on Vancouver Island just because of the astonishing rate of old growth logging here on the island, and because, so much of it is old growth logging. Did you want to say anything about that, Andy?
No. The most tree species rich forests we have in British Columbia are in the West Kootenays. Mm-hmm. And I think we have concerns about old growth and what's happening to it all over the province. I'm talking about Vancouver Island today simply because that's where I live, and a lot of my actions have been lately. But I think, Galen, the idea of doing sessions from other parts of the province or including other parts of the province is a really good recommendation. Absolutely.
And for those of you who missed the last webinars, we heard from Sharon up in the Chilcotin region in the Chilcotin, and really encourage you to go back and listen to that one. And we've got a question about fungi. Which 2 fungi produce the Taxol?
I think they've subsequently found more than those 2 species that produce the Taxol. They're filamentous fungi and the ascomycetes, which is the group of fungi that when they reproduce sexually, they produce acai. There are a lot of different fungi that are being isolated as endophytes. About 80% of them are ascomycetes. Filamentous fungi, a lot of them are also known as saprobes or decomposer fungi, but their role as endophytes seems to be quite different. One of the really interesting aspects of the whole ecosystem, I think we can call a plant an ecosystem now because they've got fungal endophytes, fungal or bacterial endophytes and viral endophytes at least, and they're producing all kinds of different chemicals. And for me, a really interesting question is why? These are obviously long associations. What is the value to the plant? What is the value to the fungus? And how does it affect the way an ecosystem operates? Bottom line, discovering the diversity and abundance of fungal endophytes fundamentally changes the way that we understand how plants operate and how plant communities and ecosystems operate.
Great, thanks, Andy. John, do you want to pull up another question? Oh, did you go mute again, I think? There we go. All right, John, go for it.
Great stuff. So one question here. So are economically important mushrooms such as morels considered when cut blocks are laid out on Crown land? And
the answer is almost never. And there have been some good studies that look at the values of harvested mushrooms compared with the values of timber that are removed from stands, especially when you consider that the timber is removed once every 40 or 60 or 100 years, and the fungi can be picked every year. Morels are not a particularly good example to use for this because almost all of the commercial morel harvest in British Columbia comes from areas that have been burnt by forest fires. But the concerns that are being raised in places like the Nass Valley and in Haida Gwaii, for example, are to do with other commercially important fungi like chanterelles and pine mushrooms that depend on older forests, at least 40-year-old forests, but preferably much older than that, for their fruiting. I mentioned that the commercially important fungi, just about all the large fungi we see in the woods in the autumn, including all the commercially important ones, except for morels, are the fruiting bodies of fungi growing attached to the roots of the trees. You cut the trees down, the mushrooms disappear. And this was a real flashpoint in Haida Gwaii near Skidegate Lake about a little less than a decade ago. And they've now set a few areas aside in Haida Gwaii for their production of valuable mushrooms. But this has happened almost nowhere else around the province, as far as I know.
Great, thanks. Now I see Jennifer here. Jennifer is organizer out in Grand Forks. And Jennifer, I'm going to unmute you here. So if you'd like to ask your question with your microphone, you can go ahead and do it. And if not, if I don't hear you, then I'll just go ahead and ask it. Hearing nothing. Jennifer's question is a good one. It's, what is the organization group that is tracking who is buying BC wood? Is it Canopy?
Yeah, Canopy are the people that I have had interaction with, and they try and work with people who are buying BC forest products to make sure that they understand the importance that we associate with our old growth forests in British Columbia. And through friends in Canopy, I met a fellow who worked with as one of the chief people at Marks and Spencer, for example, who was very interested in where some of their rayon was being sourced from, and wanted to ensure that it wasn't being manufactured from old growth forests in British Columbia. There are probably other groups that track the destination of forest products. Forest Ethics used to do that. I'm not sure Jens may have some insight as to that as well. Jens?
Jens,
Yes.
go ahead, yeah.
Sure. So Forest Ethics is now stand.earth, and they were a little less active over a period of time on forest issues and were more in the news and fighting pipelines, but they just hired a new forest campaigner. Her name is Tegan Hansen, and they do continue to do this work. In fact, they have expanded their research in the context of markets work and buyers. So we hope that they will play a stronger role in the near future in BC forest campaigns. And I'm happy to share contact info, and you can ask Stan directly if you have any requests. Generally speaking, it's stand.earth and Greenpeace as well, but Greenpeace definitely a little less visible right now in BC forest campaigns. But globally, Greenpeace continues to play a role there too, finding out who the buyers are and using the information for forest campaigns.
Great. Thanks, Jens. Over to you for another question, John.
Okay, thanks, Galen. Yeah, so one from June Ross. She's mentioned, I think, this feeling that many of us feel, which is, we've been lobbying quite a bit to no end, and nothing seems to take effect with government. Just personally, what do you feel are the best steps that we can take in response to this? Any ideas you have?
Boy, I wish I had better ideas. It's intensely frustrating. I was having a conversation with some friends from another group the other day over a cup of coffee, and suggesting that maybe over 15 years of campaigning, there had not been a tree saved from being logged. And I don't think that's too far off the mark. I mean, outside of Great Bear Rainforest, of course. But on Vancouver Island, for example, or elsewhere, it's just intensely frustrating. I had hoped from conversations with members of the incoming government that we might be able to protect a little bit more old growth forests than we were able to under the Liberals, and certainly there's been no less logging of old growth under the NDP than there have been under the Liberals. In fact, the numbers might be even, I believe, a little bit larger than they were under the Liberals. And I guess if the government has to choose between the United Steelworkers, who ran their election campaign and financed a lot of their election campaign and represent an awful lot of the unionized loggers on the coast of British Columbia, to choose between them and the environment, I think they've made their choices abundantly clear. Sorry, June, I wish I could give you more reason for optimism. Maybe the always optimistic Jens will give us some more reasons for optimism here.
I'm unmuted, huh? Okay, so yeah. So in short, I agree with your assessment. It's business as usual right now. I do see a change in terms of more anger. So there's increasing support for protecting the last old growth. And right now, with the recent news about BC timber sales blogs, I see more people approaching us. There are more people asking groups like Sierra Club BC, hey, you should drop your charitable status, and we need another war in the woods. So I think what will happen is that we will see more activists taking direct action. And I do think that this government has even greater responsibility now compared to the previous one, because they are now making decisions over the very last percentage points. So the situation was already dire in the last 15 years, but now it's even worse. So the moral responsibility is also even greater. And this is now combined with the climate emergency, where climate science is clear that we have to bring emissions down the next 10 years, or we are looking at catastrophic impacts. So I kind of expect that we will see more action, and groups like Sierra Club BC have to continue to do some of the work that we are currently doing. That means we have to talk with the government when possible. We have to create as much media coverage as possible, and concerned citizens like you have to continue the work. Don't stop, don't get tired, because this is a growing movement. That means every letter, every call, every meeting with your MLA helps. They are counted, and if we can keep the numbers up and grow them, I think that we can still win this. And I do know that time is running out, so the next year or two before the next election are really important. I remain hopeful, but it's not based on facts right now. It's more based on conviction.
Am I muted, or am I?
You're on.
Okay. Yeah. I remain optimistic simply because I don't think there's any other way to deal with an issue like this, and because the stakes are too high. So I certainly intend to remain vigorously engaged. And I also just wanted to mention, I was talking about those two political parties. We do have a third party in government right now, and I think we're going to hear from the Greens fairly soon on old growth forest issues. So I'm hopeful that that may have more influence on the government than the BC Chambers of Commerce, the Union of BC Municipalities, and all the members of the general public supporting groups like the Sierra Club have had so far. We shall see. Remain optimistic.
And that's my cue to jump in and remind everyone that Sierra Club BC is a charitable nonprofit group and totally nonpartisan. And so I want to steer us away from any political party debates. But I will also offer a bit of optimism. As an organizer working on forest issues, I've noticed a ton of enthusiasm, like more in the last 6 months than before in the time that I've been doing this work. For example, this webinar got a huge response, bigger than similar types of things that we've done. I've seen, there's lots of activists in the Kootenays. It's cool to see Jennifer Houghton on here doing so much work in Grand Forks, and then, tons of people here on the coast. So I see a lot of enthusiasm and a lot of anger in, the lack of action from the government. So I'll just reiterate the action of the week this week that we mentioned at the beginning is to send an actual handwritten physical letter to Minister Doug Donaldson. His address, it appears in the chat box here, and it's also in the last email that I sent out, the last couple of emails actually, yesterday and today. So I really like the idea of us barraging his office with letters. The whole idea of all of these different ways to contact people who have power and influence is that they start to get scared that actually people might care about this issue, and then they start to think, well, yeah, maybe we do need to do something about it. Another thing, well, actually, I'm going to wait. We're going to announce a day of action that we're planning, but I'll wait until just the very end to announce that. Andy, I think maybe we've got time for one more question. John, is there another question that you see there that hasn't been asked? And you can go ahead,
yeah.
John. Yep.
So, just one that recently came in, just more, so on our old growth forests, is it true, do you know, that the companies that log it are owned or part owned by the BC Municipal Pension Plan?
By the provincial pension plan, certainly. I don't know about municipal pension plans, but it's entirely possible.
So the Timber West is owned by two big pension funds, right?
Mm-hmm.
But I would have to look up the two owners.
Yeah, I believe the British Columbia Provincial Pension Plan is partner to that, but I don't know about municipal pension plans.
Right.
Okay. Any final thoughts, Andy, before we sign off?
Well, thanks everybody for joining us for the discussion today. And yeah, I just want to take a step back and not be as perhaps defeatist as I sounded before. Jens was right to call me on that. I've been at this for a while. I had high hopes for the new Democratic Party in government. It's not playing out that way, but that doesn't mean that it's not going to. And I think with the involvement and support of all of these people and everybody else you've been hearing from, that I'll remain an optimist.
Good. That's good to hear. Thanks, Andy. And thanks for your presentation and for staying on to answer questions. It's really been great to have your knowledge here, and a big addition to this webinar series.
And I see a few more questions. You can.
Well, actually, Jens, we're about out of time, but we can move those over to the Sierra Club BC Facebook group. So for those of you who are on Facebook, you will have received links from me for the Facebook group. If you're not on Facebook, you can send the questions to me, and I can work on getting them answered. So in the next email I'll send, we can include a couple resources. Andy, if you've got any resources that you want to share with the group, you can send those on to me for me to send out. I want to thank everyone for being here and taking part in this webinar. As I said, we're gonna announce an action. We're gonna do a day of action for forests on Thursday, June 6th. And so we're asking everybody here and our supporters beyond, we're also reaching out to other groups working on this issue, to show up at their MLA's offices, to hold a small demonstration. You can be as creative as you like, and we're all gonna do it on the same day and try to reach as many members of the legislature as we can. So that's Thursday, June 6th, and I'll send out more information. Again, for this week, please send a handwritten letter to Doug Donaldson. Take a picture of your letter or of yourself sending it, and either send it to me and post it. Let's have a massive amount of mail arriving at his office in the next few days. And I'll also send out those talking points that Jens included in the chat box here. For next week, we've got another excellent talk. It's going to be Guy Dauncey. He's an ecofuturist who works to develop a positive vision of a sustainable future and to translate that vision into action. He's the co-founder of the BC Sustainable Energy Association and the Victoria Car Share Cooperative. He's the author of more than 9 books, including The Climate Challenge 101 Solutions to Global Warming. If you haven't heard him speak, he's a great speaker, and really looking to his talk next week on forestopias. And if you've enjoyed participating in this series, we invite you to become a sustaining member and to make a monthly donation to Sierra Club BC. If you donate $25 or more, you'll get a t-shirt mailed out to you, a Sierra Club BC t-shirt. It's been really fun hosting another webinar series. I am going to be in the forest on Vancouver Island next week, up with the campaigners and taking part in field assessments. So I will be turning over the hosting reins to John and others and Guy Dauncey. So please come back, and I'll see you again in a couple weeks. But John and Guy Dauncey and everyone will see you same time next week, Thursday from noon to 1 Pacific time. John, any final words? And he's muted again, so we'll leave it at that. Thanks again, everybody, and we'll see you over either in email or on Facebook.